Hello and welcome to a new episode of That Fertile Feeling, the podcast. My name is Françoise, and today I wanted to talk to you about what folk mythology can teach us about fertility. And this is very much inspired by a course I just took over the Christmas holidays with a Dutch animist, I want to say expert. Her name is Naomi Mirkrida. And over the Christmas holidays, she released a bundle of ancient Dutch or Northern European fairy tales. I've been wanting to reconnect with my spiritual roots or the ancient wisdom that's here in my country. And I joined her course. She would read us all of these ancient fairy tales and then also, or folk stories really, and also explain their deeper significance. And I realized there's this one story that she shared that there was so much interesting information about fertility in there. And what I love about these stories is that this is fairy tales and myths. Those are the ancient ways of passing on knowledge, right? Before people could read and write, this is how we connected. And when you start looking into those ancient stories, you can trace them back to really, really ancient times. There's so much knowledge that has been passed on over centuries, over generations. Um, so in this story, I found some information or some knowledge that really resonated with, the own work I do as a fertility coach, as someone working or supporting women through fertility challenges and dealing with loss. So I followed Naomi's example. I translated one of the stories that she read to us to English, and I added some of my own analysis to the story as well. So what I will do in this episode is I will read the story to you, and then I'll go over it afterwards to give you to explain the symbolism that's there, to give you the significance for anyone who's on a fertility journey. And I think you can really, there's so much wisdom in here. So let's start with the story. And this story, it is located in a place called the Old Ekelenberg, or then Ekel. It was a place that had seen much in the many, many years people had walked over it, and it too had changed over the years. People had settled around it, fishing in the river and the nearby pools. They were tough as leather and managed to survive with great difficulty. When they died, they were cremated. The smoke would drift over the hill and the flames would consume everything that they could decay. The glow of the fire could be seen from far, far away. When the fire was extinguished, the ashes were gathered into a pot, which was then buried on the old Ekel, so on the mountain, alongside others. This went on for generation after generation until the Great Plague struck. Few people survived, and most of those left fled, afraid of the scourge that had overtaken them. A few remained, including the Wickerse, the wise woman. She lived for many years and often, unable to sleep, would climb to the highest point of Den Ekel, so the mountain, at night. She would sit there for hours, gazing out over the low-lying land. When the moonlight filtered through the tree branches, it seemed as if she were spinning thread. People in the area would say in the evenings, "Do you see the Spinwiefien," so that wise woman, "on the Ekel? She's thinking about what's past and foreseeing what is yet to come. She is a wise woman." And whenever people were in need, they would come to her for help. They never left her presence without some comfort, until eventually her time came and she was called to the distant land of Avalon, which she believed in and described as beautiful, a place without death, hardship, misfortune, or sorrow. Even though she had passed, the people refused to believe it. They told each other that she was still there at her familiar spot, spinning as she always had when the moonlight shone eerily through the creeping mist. But now only those who truly needed her help could see her, and so the story was whispered from generation to generation. Many, many years later, Rudolf Harms and his wife, Albertine, lived in Zuidwolde. They were the only couple in the area without children, and Albertine struggled deeply with this. They waited and longed, longed and waited. When another year had passed and the New Year's visits began, Albertine often cried, knowing the comments she'd have to endure again. "I can't take it anymore. I'm not going," she said. "I can't bear their teasing and remarks." "What will people think?" her husband asked. That'll just give them more to talk about and it'll hurt you even more later. They didn't discuss it further, but things went exactly as Albertine had feared. She couldn't handle it anymore, and her face grew thinner and paler. The neighbors whispered, "What's wrong with Albertine? She looks so unwell. That's probably why she can't have children." Aunt Annegien dared to talk to Albertine about it. "You're not doing well, Albertine. What's wrong? Is something wrong between you and Roelof, or is it something else? Pour your heart out to me if you need to." Albertine had a close bond with her aunt and confessed all her worries and grief. She cried so much that Aunt Annegien didn't know what to do. When Albertine calmed down, her aunt began to share what she'd heard from her own grandmother as a child. Her grandmother was certain the Spinwiefien, so the wise woman, still appeared on the Ekel. Long ago, a woman with the same problem as Albertine had sought her out and later gave birth to 3 children. When the creeping mist covered the land, she had to walk barefoot from Den Ekel, the burial mound, to the river, wash her feet in the moonlight, and do so for 3 consecutive days. Albertine said nothing at the time, but when summer came, she snuck out of bed 3 times in a row while her husband slept soundly. She did exactly as her aunt had described, pleading, "Please let this work. Why everyone else and not me?" As she returned home, she thought she saw the Spinwiefien sitting on her spot atop den Ekel. It seemed as though she nodded at her. Albertine went back to bed at peace. No one knew why, but Albertine became very ill. She caught a chill, Aunt Annegien said. A chill in the middle of summer, the neighbors wondered. Though she was unwell for a time, Albertine recovered and began to thrive, and when May arrived, a son was born to Roelof and Albertine. The neighbors said, "Who would have thought?" But Aunt Annegien simply smiled to herself. She knew the truth. Whenever people laughed at the legend of the Spinwiefien, Aunt Annegien would say, "There's so much between heaven and earth that we don't understand. But if you believe, things often work out." So that is the story of the Spinwiefien, the wise woman. There's so much in here to unpack. So I'm just going to walk you through the story again. I should probably remind you that I'm also a social scientist. So when I read this, I'm also very much interested in how much the story tells us about power dynamics in society and what that means for ancient wisdom, how we look at ancient wisdom these days, and how, or that's my case, at least I'm starting to discover how much we've lost by the disdain that we have for ancient wisdom. So this story is situated in a place in the Netherlands called the Old Ekelenberg, Den Ekel. And what the story starts with is explaining how this place came about. So this is a place where people had settled. They fished in a nearby river and pools. They were tough as leather. They managed to survive with great difficulty. And when they died, they were cremated. And that's already very interesting to me because I've been reading up on ancient Dutch history, ancient Northern European history. So this tells me that this story tells us about a development that started around 1100 before Christ. So do you remember that I told you that there's so much information here that's passed on through over centuries? So this is a story that already we can already see this at the start of the story, that the story tells us about a time when these are like very early agricultural societies, maybe even hunter-gatherer societies. Well, if it's 1100 BC when they started cremating people, those are very early agricultural societies, and we know they mention like people were tough as leather, managed to survive with great difficulty. That's the lifestyle back in those days, because the Netherlands, it was a swamp basically. It was hard to survive here. So that's also some of the earliest accounts of the Romans who came to the Netherlands. They were like, "Oh, these people have it rough," and that's what this story, that's being told up until this day in time, reflects back to us. So when they died, people were cremated, and the glow of the fire could be seen from far, far away. And then when the fire was extinguished, the ashes were gathered into a pot, which was then buried on the old Ekel alongside others. So this really tells us about the practice of creating burial mounds. And there's an important spiritual significance to this as well, because these burial mounds weren't just places where our ancestors buried, the dead. They did so because they wanted to be able to visit them for guidance. So this is also a place of keeping that ancestral knowledge alive by creating a burial mound, a place that they could visit, and a place that is, very significant for this story. It's the place where later on, what's her name? Albertine will find guidance on her fertility journey. Well, the story continues how people lived there until the Great Plague struck. So we know that they're now actually talking about a time period, maybe mid 14th to mid 16th century in history. Few people survived, and most of those left fled, afraid of the scourge that had overtaken them. But a few remained, including the wise woman, the Spinwiefien, she's also called. Um, she lived for many years, and often unable to sleep, she would climb to the highest point of Den Ekel, the burial mound. She would sit there for hours, gazing out over the low-lying land, and it seemed as if she were spinning thread. And this is also an interesting point because spinning, weaving, this is something that you see in so many ancient myths, and it's about the old wise woman who has one foot in the land of the living, one foot in the land of the death. She's neither here nor there. And her purpose, her job really is to spin the web of life, the web of destiny. She creates our reality. She's the one who sort of oversees the bigger picture. And that's what later became the witch, the woman that we're all afraid of. But in more ancient times, she was the one who held all the knowledge. The story continues that people in the area would say in the evenings, do you see the Spinwiefien on den Ekel? She's thinking about what's past and foreseeing what is yet to come. She is a wise woman. So this again is a reference to her ability to create that web of life, of destiny. Whenever people were in need, they would come to her for help. They never left her presence without some comfort until eventually her time came and she was called to the distant land of Evelyn, which she believed in and described as beautiful, a place without death, hardship, misfortune, or sorrow. I think there's a double significance here. So it may be that, she passed on, but I think this also tells us something about how society lost its faith in wise women, in these mythical realities, in that knowledge that comes from a place between death and life, and all that can tell us about how to deal with hardship, how to deal with life. So this is something that we can definitely see during the Middle Ages with the witch hunts. This is when Christianity obviously already had a stronghold on Europe before the Middle Ages, but this is the time when it really started to bear down on ancient wisdom, ancient practices, when you had the witch hunts. So I think that this death here in the story of the wise woman is also like the death of ancient wisdom in our societies. And then the story goes on that even though she had passed, the people refused to believe it. At the same time, I think the story shows us or tells us how hard it is to really erase that ancestral knowledge. Because even though she had passed, even though we've had the witch hunts, the people refused to believe it. They told each other that she was still there at her familiar spot, spinning as she always had when the moonlight shone eerily through the creeping mist. But now only those who truly needed her help could see her. Also an interesting point, only those who truly needed her help could see her. So for me, this really signals that in the times, these rational times that we live in, where that ancient knowledge has been forgotten, it's exactly those who truly need the help of that knowledge who will find their way back to it. And then the story continues. The story was whispered from generation to generation. So even though there have been all of these efforts to eradicate that ancestral wisdom, the stories are still whispered from generation to generation. Many, many years later, Roelof Harms and his wife Albertine lived in Zuidwolde. So that's a place close to the Ekelenberg. They were the only couple in the area without children, and Albertine struggled deeply with this. They waited and longed and waited. And when another year had passed and the New Year's visits began, Albertine often cried, knowing the comments she'd have to endure again. I can't take it anymore. I'm not going, she said. I can't bear their teasing and remarks. I just highlighted this because I feel this sentiment is so recognizable for anyone who's dealing with fertility issues, the sense of isolation. And I found it comforting, I think, to read that back in the story and to see this is something that doesn't just apply to you. This is universal. The feeling of isolation when you're facing fertility challenges, even the teasing, the remarks, the insensitivities, it's there. It's always been there. So don't be too hard on yourself. Don't beat yourself up if you have trouble facing people, because this is really a challenging journey. And then the story also tells like people, the neighbors whispered, "What's wrong with Albertine? She looks so unwell. That's probably why she can't have children." Well, that's also very reminiscent of, people telling you, "Oh, just relax and it will happen. Just take a holiday, right? Go on holiday, drink some wine." I don't know. I feel even if this is a story that goes back to maybe 1100 BC, it's very, very, very recognizable. But there was one woman, Aunt Annegien, who dared to talk to Albertine about it. She said, "You're not doing well, Albertine. What's wrong? Is something wrong between you or Rudolf, or is it something else? Pour out your heart to me if you need it." And then Albertine, she confessed all her worries and grief. And in response, her aunt started to share what she'd heard from her own grandmother as a child. So I love that. That's again showing that those who truly needed her help, needed the help of this wise woman, could see her. When Albertine really needed this ancestral knowledge, it came to her through the whispers of the grandmother to her aunt. The story tells us that Aunt Annegien's grandmother was certain the Spinwiefien still appeared on Den Ekel. Long ago, a woman with the same problem as Albertine had sought her out and later gave birth to 3 children. When the creeping mist covered the land, she had to walk barefoot from Den Ekel, so from the mountain, the burial mound, to the river, wash her feet in the moonlight, and do so for 3 consecutive days. There's a lot of information to unpack in this one assignment. So when the creeping mist covered the land, um, usually early morning, late at night, it's, you get this fog in the air. And that's when the wise women are around. Those fogs, at least in the Netherlands, they are seen as representations of the white women. They're called the witte wieven. So it's the white women who stand at that gateway between life and death, who hold the power, who hold the knowledge. Thereabouts when you have those foggy nights, those foggy mornings. And when these wise women were around, Albertine had to walk barefoot from the burial mound to the river. The burial mound is obviously the place where life and death come together, as happens in the womb, right? The womb is the gateway both to life and to death, which, if you've ever lost a baby, you may be very familiar with. Your womb is a gateway, and maybe that, a portal to both of these worlds. And that might sound really scary, but actually, it's just there's so much power in recognizing that you, as a woman, you have that portal. You have access to both the realm of the living and the dead. And rather than shy away from death as a topic that's very, very hard to come to terms with, this is our innate power. For me, it's been one of the biggest initiations with my loss to be able to come to terms with death. And I think that's also the significance really of the burial mound in the story here. It's about opening you up to those different realms, also to the ancient wisdom. It's about connecting to a time when we realized we were not in control of life. We are just a portal. I think that is what I want to say. We are not in control of life. We are just a portal. That's what the burial mound can show us. And then by walking barefoot to the river, Albertine made the connection to water. Water is the symbol for life, for fertility, to flow. Water also marks the border between life and death in many animist stories. So again, there's that idea of those multiple realms or those two realms there. But it's also like the place where life begins in water. And the fact that she has to do so barefoot, she has to walk from the burial mound to the river barefoot, tells us a lot about the importance of grounding yourself. This is the explanation I actually got from Naomi. So the importance of grounding yourself, and I really recognize that self in the work that I do, is that coming home to your body, coming home to your womb space, for us people who live so much in our heads, in our minds, that's the crucial step on the fertility journey. It's about learning to feel again. It's about learning to be in your body again, be with everything that comes up. You want to open up to life, but that means you also open up to the possibility of death, and that's scary. So be with the fears, be with the discomfort, because it's through that grounding in your body, in your womb space, in the discomfort, that you learn to surrender. And we'll get to the point of surrender later on in the story. So that's what Albertine needed to do. She needed to confront the realm between life and death, walk barefoot, ground herself in the reality that we are not in control, and still walk to the river, wash her feet in the moonlight in that symbol for life and fertility. Even though there wasn't a guaranteed outcome, she had to do so for 3 consecutive days, showing her resolve to really be in this initiation that is the fertility journey. So the story continues. Albertine said nothing at the time, but when summer came, she snug out of bed 3 nights in a row while her husband slept soundly. She did exactly as her aunt had described, pleading, "Please let this work. Why everyone else and not me?" And again, this for me is a very powerful sentence. Please let this work. Why everyone else and not me? And you might think this is a lot of self-pity here, but actually what she is doing here is surrendering to the fact that she's not in control, asking for guidance, asking for divine intervention, however you want to call it. And that's one of the most powerful steps that you can take. It's one of the most powerful steps I took on my own fertility journey, and that I see happening with my clients as well, is when you are at your wit's end, when you can't carry the journey any longer, bow down to it, bow down to a higher power, whatever that looks like for you, and say, I don't know how to do this anymore. I don't know how to carry this. Please show me the way. And what that does, that absolute surrender to not being in control, not knowing, is it opens you up, because you stop forcing something, you stop forcing an outcome to happen, you stop trying to do everything that you can to make it work. And that's the beauty. When you open up the field, new solutions present themselves. It may be your subconscious, it may be higher guidance, whatever you want to call it. But when you can truly surrender and open up to a journey, something starts to flow again, like the water, like the fertility. As Albertine returned home, she thought she saw the Spinwiefien sitting at her spot atop Den Ekel. It seemed as though she nodded at her. So I love this, in this place of surrender, Albertine found her connection to the Spinwiefien, to that ancestral knowledge, to that spiritual guidance. And Albertine went back to bed at peace. No one knew why, but Albertine became very ill. She caught a chill, Aunt Annegien said. A chill in the middle of summer, the neighbors wondered. Though she was unwell for a time, Albertine recovered and began to thrive. And when May arrived, a son was born to Roelof and Albertine. You can explain this in 2 different ways. Either she got morning sickness, but I don't think, if it's the middle of summer and her son arrives in May, then I don't think it was actually morning sickness. I think what this means is that Albertine had to go through an internal healing process. So in that process of surrender, of not knowing, of really surrendering to not being in control, that had sort of a physical effect. It's what we see all the time, right? The body-mind connection. So this may have been, she became very ill. This may have been like a cleansing process where she was releasing all of those things that were keeping her down. And in the end, she recovered, she began to thrive. And when May arrived, a son was born to Rudolf and Albertine. The neighbor said, "Who would have thought?" But Aunt Annegien simply smiled to herself. She knew the truth. Whenever people laughed at the legend of the Spinwiefien, Aunt Annegien would say, "There's so much between heaven and earth that we don't understand, but if you believe, things often work out." And I also love this ending. There's so much between heaven and earth that we don't understand. I mean, if there's anything that this applies to, it's fertility. There's a lot we know, and then there's the mystery of conception, and we'll probably never fully understand the mystery of conception. And that is why surrender is key to this process of fertility. It's because we're never fully in control. We'll never fully understand the mystery of conception. And when we can surrender to that, we create an openness, an invitation for life. It's really the core of my work. What I help women do is to feel that if you can surrender to the journey, you start to soften, you start to relax. Easier said than done, but I want you to know that it is possible for you. And yeah, I would say that's the main takeaway of this story as well. It is possible, and there's so much healing possible for you. So thank you so much for tuning into the podcast this week. This is a different episode than I do usually, but I love working with my intuition. I heard this story and I realized straight away that I wanted to record a podcast about this story and what it means, what I think it means. With huge thanks to Naomi Mirkrida. I will put her details in the show notes so you can look her up if you want to know more about ancient Dutch mythology. And I would also definitely recommend that you start reading up on the mythology of the place where you're from or where your ancestors from, because connecting to this ancestral wisdom is so powerful. It will change your life. Thanks so much for tuning in this week. If you want to reach out to me, you can find me on Instagram at That Fertile Feeling, or email me at francoise@thatfertilefeeling.com. And if you want to look into doing a session with me to explore that whole concept of surrender a bit more, I'll also put a booking link in the show notes. You can also book me through my website, but we can set up like a 30-minute discovery call, free discovery call for you to see if we, for us both, to see if we're a good fit. Thank you so much, and hope to see you back in 2 weeks' time. Bye-bye.